Well, well, well. Jack Curtiz in person.
That's the trouble with you actors, Ronnie. No appreciation for what we directors do to make you look good.
Oh, Morgan would love to hear you say that.
Ronald Reagan appears to be heading toward a landslide electoral victory tonight across the United States.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I spent 10 years working on this book. It's not a hit job, and it's not a hagiography. It's an attempt to get the story right of a president who was often an enigma, even to those closest to him.
Hello, and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Karen Tumulty, a columnist and associate editor here at the Post, and it's my great honor today to welcome my colleague, Max Boot, to talk about his groundbreaking new book about Ronald Reagan. It's called Reagan, His Life and Legend. So welcome back to Washington Post Live.
It's a pleasure to be on, and especially to be on with a fellow historian of the Reagans.
Well, and that's funny. We probably, full disclosure here, Max and I first met in the very, very chilly research room of the Reagan Library, which they keep around 50 degrees.
Yes.
But you began working on this in 2013. And it's been estimated that something like 11,000 books have been written about Ronald Reagan. Too many of them politically slanted, either as hagiographies, as you said, or hit jobs. But you write, the passage of more than 30 years since he left office affords the kind of understanding of his presidency that historians finally achieved only in the 1980s of the Eisenhower administration. So, Max, what did you learn that really most surprised you about Ronald Reagan?
Well, you're absolutely right, Karen, that there are a lot of books about Ronald Reagan, including some very good books, but there has not been a definitive biography to date. And that's really what I was trying to achieve, to tell the whole story with the benefit of historical hindsight and objectivity, and to really provide a balanced account. And I learned a great deal about Reagan's life in the process, and I've been very gratified to see that readers are reading this book and saying, I learned new stuff. And by the way, that includes Patty Davis and Ron Reagan, Reagan's own children, who read the book and told me that they learned new things about their father from the book. I think the two big kind of the big takeaway that I have from the book is that Reagan was both more ideological and more pragmatic than most people realize, or that I realized before starting this book project more than a decade ago. He was much more ideological, especially in the late 50s, early 60s, when he was converting with a zealous convert to the right-wing cause, and he was accusing Democrats of taking America down the road to communism with, programs like Medicare and Medicaid, and he was opposing civil rights laws, and he seemed like he was very far to the right, and you can see why a lot of people were frightened when he became governor of California in 1967, or when he became president of the United States in 1981. But in both jobs, what I discovered was that he really confounded expectations. He did not govern nearly as far to the right as a lot of his supporters hoped, or a lot of his critics feared. He actually veered to the center and did things like signing the most liberal abortion law in the country as governor of California, or raising taxes more often than he cut them as both president and as governor, or in 1986, signing an immigration law that provided a path to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants, or finally, his crowning achievement, working with Mikhail Gorbachev to peacefully end the Cold War. That is not something that anybody could have expected at the start of his public career in the late 1940s. As kind of a red hunter in Hollywood, leader of the Screen Actors Guild, somebody who was, trying to root out what he saw wrongly, I think, as a communist attempt to take over Hollywood. And yet, by the end of his life, after having been this inveterate foe of communism, he was working with the arch communists in the world to beat swords into plowshares. That's a trajectory that I don't think anybody could have expected, and I think should surprise anyone even looking back with hindsight.
Well, you also describe him as someone often accused of having simplistic views, but he was hardly a simple man. And that it extended to Ronald Reagan as a person. You know, one of the things I was surprised to learn was that how much of a loner he was. His only real friend really was the woman he married. And yet he was the great communicator. He was able to connect with the entire country in a way I think few people ever have. So where do you think those sort of contradictions come from?
I really think, as with most of us, Karen, it really traces back to his early childhood. And you can see the influences if you trace them from the beginning to the end. The fact that he had a lot of trouble making connections with people, and he also had a horror of personal conflicts. Both of those are due to his very difficult itinerant childhood as the son of a alcoholic shoe salesman and his very dramatic mother, religious mother, Nellie. Jack and Nellie Reagan were often fighting. They were often moving. And so, young Dutch Reagan, as he was then known, did not really stay in any one town long enough to make a lot of friends. And so he kind of shied away from forging those kinds of deep personal bonds. And he also, heard through the thin walls of their house his parents often arguing, and there was one crisis after another in this family. And so he also shied away from the kind of personality conflicts that are often an accompaniment to very close relationships. And so he chose to keep everybody at kind of a safe remove, using his jokes and his stories as kind of a way to keep people at arm's length and kind of hide in plain sight. But his mother also inculcated in him a love of drama, and she was kind of a frustrated actress who was always putting on plays in churches and in local in local theaters in the small towns where they lived, and got Dutch on the stage from a very early age. And he remembered really enjoying the sound of that applause. And so I think that's what ultimately led him to Hollywood and eventually into politics, where he became a very expert performer, even more expert in politics than in movies, but somebody who didn't really want to get close to anybody, and kept much of the world at a safe remove. So much so that Stu Spencer, who was his longtime political consultant and one of my best interview subjects for this book, Stu said to me, Reagan would have made a pretty good hermit because he really didn't need anybody aside from maybe Nancy Reagan. Even though he projected this image of warmth, he was actually at the end of the day, there was kind of an iciness at his core.
He made it to Hollywood. He got a contract in the late 1930s, but by the early 50s, he was pretty washed out. He had never really been the matinee idol that he had hoped to be. People called him the Errol Flynn of the B movies. So how did those skills begin to pave his way into politics? Was he a good actor?
I mean, I think he was a better actor than some people give him credit for. And it's kind of interesting because Reagan, in some ways, had very little ego. I mean, you criticize his policies all day long, and he wouldn't really care one way or the other. But if you criticized his acting, then he became sensitive. He was actually very proud of his role as an actor. He didn't like it when people belittled him and said, "Oh, he was just the guy in Bedtime for Bonzo." And he was a decent actor, but certainly not. Nobody would ever mistake him for Laurence Olivier. But the skills that he learned as an actor, he began to translate into politics in the 1950s, working for General Electric. That was really the job that saved his career. After his movie days were over, he became the host of General Electric Theater, this national program on CBS, and he began touring the country for General Electric and began speaking to all sorts of audiences. And that's really where he learned to do a stump speech. And it wasn't because he had great speechwriters. He was writing his own speeches. He was, writing them out on index cards, shuffling the index cards, giving the speech. And at the same time, he was also getting a political education because GE in those days was a very political company. It was very right-wing. They thought that, to prevent strikes and union activity, they had to proselytize for right-wing free market economics and social views. And so they had their employees reading all these, right-wing magazines, right-wing tracts, some of them, pretty extreme, so much so that one of the GE executives compared their outlook to that of the John Birch Society. And so Reagan, when he was on these long train rides across the country, because he had a fear of flying in those days, he would be on these long train rides and he would be reading all this right-wing literature, and then he would be putting it to use, on the factory floor or wherever he was speaking for GE. And that was really his training ground to be a politician. So, people were surprised when he ran for his first office in 1966 as governor of California that he was, people scoffed, oh, he was just an actor, but he actually turned out to be a very good politician because it wasn't really new to him. He'd been doing, political type speeches for more than a decade at that point.
Well, let's take a step back from that 1966 race to the moment when he first makes his entry onto the political stage, which is a speech that he gives on the eve of the 1964 election for the Barry Goldwater campaign. Let's listen to part of that speech.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We will keep in mind and remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith that you and I have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny.
And of course, Barry Goldwater went down to a landslide defeat of epic proportions, and the Republican Party was really in bad shape after that, when a bunch of big influential Californians come to Reagan and suggest that he might consider running for governor. Was he a good governor?
Well, before we get to governor, let me just make a couple of fast points. One about that 1964 time for choosing speech, which, as you suggested, is what launched him into national politics. If you actually read the speech carefully, it's a much weirder speech than people realize, because even in that clip where he's warning about 1,000 years of darkness and tyranny descending on America, what is he actually talking about? If you decipher it, what he's talking about are programs like Medicare and Medicaid and the Civil Rights Act, all of those pieces of landmark legislation, which most people applaud today, he was warning was going to lead to the loss of complete freedom in America, which shows you, how far to the right he was at the time. But I mean, it was certainly something that energized the Republican base, but also alarmed a lot of other people. But, nobody listening to that speech, I think, could have expected that once he actually became governor, he would be as centrist as he actually turned out to be. Some of the more interesting conversations I had for this book was actually asking Jerry Brown, his successor as governor and son of the man he beat in 1966, Pat Brown, asking Jerry Brown, what did he think of Ronald Reagan as governor? And he told me Reagan was a pretty good governor. And by the way, Willie Brown, who was, the longtime Democratic Speaker of the California Assembly, said the same thing. Reagan was actually a pretty good governor. And conversely, a lot of right-wingers were very unhappy because they said, and as one of them put it, when you come right down to it, there's a heck of a lot more government in California when Reagan left than when he arrived, which is exactly right, because he actually basically grew the government, both spending and the number of government employees basically grew at a similar rate as under Pat Brown, his Democratic predecessor. So it's this, the essential paradox of Ronald Reagan, that he was so far to the right as a campaigner and yet often so centrist once in government.
Even before he was sworn in as governor, the front page of the New York Times was talking about him as a presidential prospect. He thought about it, made a few steps in '68, did a really audacious primary challenge of Gerald Ford in '76. And then in 1980, it finally happens. But that race was pretty close going into the election. I mean, as we're looking at a very pivotal presidential debate coming up now. And Reagan ends it by asking voters this question. Let's listen.
Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
So, I mean, we've heard so many politicians echo that question since then. How much of a difference did that debate make and that question make?
The debate made a real difference because, you know, Carter was in trouble in 1980 because the economy was in poor shape, and of course, we were in the midst of the Iran hostage crisis. But people still had a lot of doubts about whether this washed-up actor could actually become president, and he put a lot of those doubts to rest with his masterful performance, even though there was a fundamental deception in his most famous line in that debate. It wasn't even that line about, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? The most famous line in that debate was when Reagan said, there you go again, which was this devastating put down to Jimmy Carter and played into this popular perception that Jimmy Carter was somehow being mean. He wasn't quite the goody-goody that he made himself out to be. And yet, when Reagan actually said, there you go again, what was he referring to? He was referring to Jimmy Carter saying very accurately that Reagan had opposed Medicare in 1965. Reagan denied that he had opposed Medicare and said he merely quibbled with the bill and that he had, he supported another bill that was just as good. But the reality is Medicare covered all seniors, whereas the bill that Reagan supported would have covered about 2% of seniors. And in fact, far from supporting an alternative, he was warning that Medicare was going to lead to the loss of freedom in America. So, the argument that Reagan made was fundamentally deceptive, but nobody really cared because his one-liners, including "There you go again," and "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" those resonated, and people were fed up with Carter largely because of the performance of the economy.
And it turned out to be pretty much of a landslide. That election got called, didn't it, before the polls even closed on the West Coast?
Yeah, while Reagan was getting out of the shower around 5 o'clock at his home in LA. Yeah.
So let's trace the arc of that presidency a bit. The first couple of years were pretty awful economically. It was the worst recession since the Great Depression, and Republicans did horribly in the first midterm. So what happened? Why was it morning in America by 1984?
I would argue a lot of the credit really goes to Paul Volcker because Volcker, as Fed chairman, really wrung inflation out of the economy. But he did it, of course, by raising interest rates very high, which produced the very severe recession of 1981 to 1983, which accounted for those Republican losses in 1982. But essentially what happened was by 1984, inflation was no longer a major factor, and the economy, having suffered a severe recession, had a major bounce back. And economic growth in 84 was unusually elevated. It was something like 7%, a figure I would not achieve again. But Reagan was basically able to claim credit for that. And I don't think you can really say that it was his tax cuts that or his policies that really turned the economy around. I think it was a combination of the Fed's policies and just the natural working of the business cycle. But he certainly stood by. Volcker did not criticize the Fed, and he elevated the nation's spirits. He kept people going in a very tough time with his very sunny, optimistic outlook and his ability to communicate. And therefore, by 1984, he was able to reap the benefits with this very positive Morning in America campaign, which resulted in a historic landslide.
And only weeks into his presidency, as we were reminded with the attempt on Donald Trump's life last month, or in July, Reagan came very, very close to death with an would-be assassin's bullet. Did that change him?
Well, the shooting was probably the most traumatic event of his presidency, but it was also in some ways the most uplifting. That was really I call the chapter on the shooting his finest hour in the book, because it really was. I mean, Reagan did not see combat in World War II. There wasn't much heroism you can point to in his life after his youthful career as a lifeguard on the Rock River in Dixon, Illinois. But he was undoubtedly courageous and heroic in the face of this terrible adversity where he almost died. And yet he was quipping in the hospitals with the doctors saying, "I hope you're all Republicans," and telling Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And that was when the public heard about that, that really cemented Reagan's bond with the public, a bond that would never really be broken. It also, I think, had an impact on him because, as he wrote in his diary, it really, he didn't wear his religion on his sleeve, but he was definitely devout, and he was convinced that the good Lord had saved him from an assassin's bullet for a higher purpose, and he thought that higher purpose was to eradicate the threat of nuclear war. And so he, he would devote himself in the years ahead to trying to end the Cold War, although it was certainly a rocky path. And before the Cold War ended, it actually reached a very dangerous point in 1983 when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were probably closer to war than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis.
And it really, there were a whole bunch of Soviet leaders in those early years. They kept dying on him. I mean, it finally is Mikhail Gorbachev with whom he finds a partner that he can deal with. So talk about that a little bit, that relationship.
Well, that relationship was pivotal. There's kind of this, I talk about in the subtitle of the book about Reagan, his life and legends, and one of the most enduring legends about Reagan is that he bankrupted the Soviet Union, that his defense buildup convinced the Soviets they had to sue for peace, and the result was the end of the Cold War. And that's not really what happened. Actually, in his first term, when he was at his most bellicose, talking about the evil empire and raising defense spending by record amounts in peacetime, that was when we had one dangerous crisis after another with the Soviet Union, with these elderly apparatchiks who were leading the Soviet Union. His policies did not really bear any fruit until 1985, when Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a very different kind of communist leader, came to power. And Gorbachev was somebody who had risen to the top of this communist system, but had lost faith with it. And he wanted to reform the Soviet Union, not because he wanted to keep up with the U.S. in an arms race or because, he felt compelled to do so by the U.S. defense buildup. Gorbachev just thought the whole arms race was incredibly wasteful, and he wanted to be able to spend more money on the needs of ordinary Soviet citizens. And so therefore, he wanted to end the arms race. And I think what Reagan should really get credit for is not for spending the Soviet Union to bankruptcy, which he did not do. The Soviet Union was, their economy was growing slowly, but it was not bankrupt. It could have survived just as Cuba and North Korea and others have survived. What Reagan really deserves credit for is recognizing that Gorbachev was a different kind of communist leader, somebody he could work with, even though a lot of people on the right, including his own defense secretary, Cap Leinberger, were highly, highly skeptical. But the turning point was that Geneva summit in 1985 when Reagan met Gorbachev for the first time. And, he established this bond, this rapport that hastened the end of the Cold War.
After a landslide victory in 1984, and he has a pretty rocky second term. He gets some big things done. He gets tax reform, he gets immigration reform. But then comes the Iran-Contra scandal where, the ultimate assessment was Reagan wasn't paying attention to a rogue national security operation in his own White House. But I want to ask you about something else, because it's been talked about quite a bit lately with Biden's age, Trump's age. Ronald Reagan was considered incredibly old for a president, even though he wasn't even 70 years old when he was first inaugurated. But he was diagnosed after he left office with Alzheimer's. And there are some people, a lot of people, who've looked at the sort of slips in his second term and thought, well, maybe there was evidence that he was somehow suffering from the disease then. You've done a lot of research into that question, including interviewing Reagan's own neurologist. So where do you come down on that?
Well, it's a complicated issue because, Reagan, by the end of his second term, was almost 78 years old. So, and he had been shot, a few years earlier. So he was clearly slowing down with age. He was not nearly as vigorous at the end of his second term as he had been at the beginning of his first term. And in fact, a lot of the White House decisions were really being made, or a lot of the administration decisions were being made by Colin Powell, Frank Carlucci, and George Shultz, who were just meeting among themselves and presenting the president with fait accomplis. So Reagan was clearly not as vigorous, but that doesn't mean that he had Alzheimer's. And I didn't really find evidence that he was suffering from dementia. I mean, the point that one of his doctors, as you alluded to, made to me from the Mayo Clinic was that he certainly had the plaques and whorls in his brain of Alzheimer's while he was president, but that doesn't mean that he had dementia. It just means that the disease was present. But if you look at indicators like his diary, his handwriting remained pretty clear and firm from beginning to end. I didn't really, I asked a lot of people about this. I didn't really find evidence of dementia, but I certainly did find evidence of the aging process, as you would expect.
So I think I'd like to close out here because we just have a few minutes left with a question about his legacy that is raised by Ramon Marks from New Hampshire, who asks, how do you rank Reagan among U.S. presidents? I mean, was he the Mount Rushmore figure that so many conservatives believe? Was he the amiable dunce that Clark Clifford said he was famously? Where does Reagan come down in kind of the annals of the American presidency?
Well, I don't think you can, as a serious student of his presidency, embrace either extreme of amiable dunce or Mount Rushmore. But I think that the consensus of historians, if you look at the C-SPAN poll of presidential historians or others, they generally place him, somewhere in the top 10, around 8 or 9, something like that, of U.S. presidents, which is pretty darn good. And I think that's probably a pretty fair judgment. He certainly had massive failures as president, a lot of which were not appreciated at the time. For example, he was not much criticized for largely ignoring the AIDS pandemic and not giving a single speech about it until 1987, even as tens of thousands of Americans died. That's a huge failure. He was certainly presided over a lot of mismanagement and scandal, including the Iran-Contra affair. He tried to weaken civil rights laws, and he, engaged in some disreputable political tactics. So those are, all problematic for his record. But I think he still can be fairly judged as a top 10 president because of his great achievements, which were to preside over a revival of the country after the tumultuous 1970s. He really lifted America's spirits and presided over the revival of the economy. And his massive achievement, which was his major achievement, was really to work with Gorbachev to peacefully end the Cold War. That's a historic record, I think. He and his supporters could be proud of.
So, what do you think Ronald Reagan might think of today's Republican Party?
I think he would be puzzled because today's Republican Party is very different from the one that he led. I mean, when you think about Reagan, he was, pro-immigration. He was very anti-Russia. He was pro-trade. These are not passions that animate today's Republican Party. I mean, there are certainly some similarities. He believed in cutting taxes and appointing conservative judges, but it's pretty clear that the Republican Party has moved very far to Reagan's right. And so I'm not sure that he would recognize today's party. He certainly would not recognize Donald Trump because Trump is in many ways, at least stylistically, kind of the anti-Reagan, because Reagan was all optimism and sweetness and light, never criticized his opponents by name. And of course, Trump is all fire and fury and denouncing his political opponents as vermin and denouncing America as an apocalyptic hellscape. So you cannot imagine, at least stylistically, although there's some continuities in terms of politics and policies, but stylistically you can't imagine two presidents more different from each other than Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, even though they were the only two U.S. presidents who ever hosted a national TV show before assuming office.
Oh boy, and it's hard to imagine any figure in America today winning 49 states.
That was a different era. That's why Reagan got a lot more done than you can imagine today. It was just a much more bipartisan era. I mean, who knows how he would have fared in the age of social media and and cable news and all the rest of it, but a very, very different landscape today.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but really, I can't recommend this book enough. It was so enlightening. But we will have to leave it there. Max, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. And I would just recommend to everybody your book, Karen's book about Nancy Reagan. I think it makes those, if you want to know about both of them, you've got my book on President Reagan and her book on Nancy Reagan. And I greatly benefited from it and learned a lot from it.
2 large volumes for your bookshelves. Anyway,
Yes.
thank all of you as well for watching. For more of the important conversations, please sign up for a Washington Post subscription. Get a free trial by visiting washingtonpost.com/live. That's washingtonpost.com/live. I'm Karen Tumulty, and thanks so much for joining us today.